Welcome to Anthodish, the weekly show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Sarah Dugnan. This week, I'm interviewing Alexis Goertz, who is a fermentation coach and expert and the co-founder of Edible Alchemy CoLaboratory. Edible Alchemy was founded in Winnipeg in January 2013 by Alexis and her business partner, Natalie, and they started out by hosting workshops to teach others about the possibilities and inevitabilities of the microbial world. This led to a spread of exciting ventures for them, including the launch of the Probiotic Bacteria Bar, talks, discussions, tours, workshops, and so much more. In 2014, Alexis moved to Berlin and brought the first bacteria bar to the city to see if there's any interest. Unsurprisingly, a large following grew from this, and Alexis began to expand the Edible Alchemy CoLaboratory across 2 continents. On this week's episode, Alexis shares her wealth of knowledge surrounding fermented foods and microbiome health. She explores the history and the reasons that cultures ferment foods worldwide and the importance of fermentation for gut health. We also talk about the ways in which fermentation scenes compare and differ between North America and Europe. And this was particularly interesting to me because I had some assumptions about North American understandings and palates regarding fermentation that she completely altered in this interview. So very exciting and very interesting talks to come from that. We also talk all about how she's helping to change the perspective on quote unquote scary or gross words like bacteria, yeast, and mold. So if even hearing those words made you a little bit squeamish right now, stay tuned because she does an absolutely amazing job normalizing the idea of bacterias and molds and connecting them with foods that you probably don't even know have mold on them. She taught me so much in this interview and has such a natural passion for and ease about translating the science of fermentation in a very fun way. Yeah, enjoy. Welcome, Alexis. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, you bet.
So let's start a little bit with your background. So can you share with listeners a bit about who you are, where you've come from, and some early influences that might have shaped your interest in foods or fermentation?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Alexis, and I'm Canadian born, but have lived around the world quite a bit. Up until this point, I've been to 43 countries, and the majority of them have actually been looking at culture and food as culture. And going around the world, I've actually discovered that pretty much actually every single culture that I've visited has something fermented. And it was kind of a roundabout way that I discovered food and fermentation because I was living in Mozambique in Africa for a year, and anytime I got sick, they were always recommending me these kind of funny, funky, sour foods. And so I came to realize that these things were fermented, and they always called them their power foods or their strengthening foods. And so I wanted to get into like, how do you make them? What's the process? And same thing in India, always giving me these sour pickles, pickled mangoes, etc., and saying that it will strengthen me. And it actually did. It actually felt like I was getting a boost every time. Plus, I love the flavor. And so through travel, I've really discovered how amazing fermented foods can be, and also learned a lot of techniques until I've brought this business from Canada, where we started it, to Berlin, Germany, and continue to teach, educate, consult, and do a lot of fermentation here.
That's amazing. It's so cool too that it's like your own personal travels have inspired your business and your ability to continue traveling through your business too.
Totally. It gives you so much inspiration to go out and collect different foods and feel what's happening in that culture, because you're also reacting with the temperature and what the produce is and what the people have developed over generations. So you never get the same thing twice. So if you like consistency, maybe fermentation isn't the thing for you because it will always be different, you know?
Fair. Okay, so for people who aren't super familiar with the idea of fermented foods, can you describe at the most basic level what a fermented food would consist of?
Sure, yeah. So fermented foods consist of more soured or yeasty things. So to put it blank, like very, very straightforward, is yeast and bacterias eating sugars and creating bubbles, or yeast and bacterias eating sugars and creating carbon dioxide, and some that also means more sour things. So if we look at the spectrum of food, we have cheese, we have sauerkraut, kimchi, sourdough bread, kombucha, water kefir, beer, wine, all things, that have even alcohol in them are fermented, because alcohol is a product of fermentation. And after you let the alcohol ferment further, all of the sugars are eaten, which then you get vinegar, which is a calorie-less food. It is super sour, super astringent, but that is the end product of fermentation. So if you look around the world, you can see that there's tons of fermented foods, right?
Yeah.
There's just like 33% of our food originally was fermented. And I'm saying including mustard and ketchup, and pretty much all of our condiments were fermented. But nowadays, of course, we industrially pasteurize them to last even longer, and so the taste doesn't change. But if you look on the back, on the recipe or the ingredients list, you will often see vinegar as an ingredient, which itself is a fermented product.
That's a fascinating answer, because and I think even I was guilty of this when I first started learning about fermented foods, but you tend to think of them as, particular foods, so like kombucha or sourdough bread or things like that, and not at how many of our foods are fermented in some way or another.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, when you've throughout your travels and your experiences learning about fermented foods, are all fermented foods made the same way, or do cultures or groups of people tend to change the processes that these foods undergo?
Our culture is changing the way that foods and cultures go, definitely. If we look again at what's happening, for example, in Berlin. Berlin is a German city. It's actually the capital of Germany. And say, 10 years ago, nobody really was doing kimchi.
Mm-hmm.
And now I run a kimchi workshop, and it just fills up like crazy because everybody's going crazy over kimchi. People are saying, yeah, it's the new sauerkraut. And the kind of workshops that I'm doing, there's also these fusion foods where you're introducing Thai spices or Vietnamese spices and lemongrass into these krauts that you would never have had even 50, 100 years ago. Definitely not. Like here in Germany, they're doing cumin and juniper berries,
Wow.
salt and cabbage. That is a sauerkraut. But they wouldn't have, peppers, and maybe onions might be a bit more exotic. But nowadays you're doing fusion where you're taking, because we have trade, right? We have all of these different kinds of vegetables coming in, as well as seeds to grow them, the opportunity to grow these vegetables and transform them into different things. So fermentation for me never gets old, even though I'm taking information from our forefathers. This isn't even my idea of fermentation. This has been around forever. And I'm just taking that information and making new ideas and combining the skills that we have been given to create new things. And it's endless, really. It's really, really endless. It will continue to change. So I don't think fermentation, this trend, is just some big wave and it's going to wash over. I really think it's something that's growing, and people are going to become quite aware what it means to eat fermented foods, or in a more specific sense, probiotic foods, which means living foods, things that are not pasteurized. There are a lot of foods that are fermented, yes, but probiotic, again, is another level of not pasteurizing your food and having it still alive.
That's awesome. And I'm wondering too, I think I agree with you when you say that fermenting foods are not just a trend, because I think if this movement has really proven anything, it's more that it's highlighting how many of our foods already were fermented, and kind of raising the awareness of consumers as to how foods are prepared, right?
Exactly.
So what are some reasons, historically, that a community or culture would start to ferment foods?
Well, definitely the biggest reason would be because they have too much of something. You have a short growing season, you have a lot of cabbages. If you don't do something with them, they're going to rot. So the way to preserve them would be a reason for fermentation. They probably weren't thinking about how great it is for your microbiome and your internal gut flora. But that was just a side effect, a good side effect that happened with it. Another reason would be, of course, taste. People love these tastes that are being made. Even fish sauce is a culinary staple in
Mm-hmm.
Asia, and that is also fermented, and that gives their soups and their meals a whole new dimension because of this umami thing happening. Another reason would be basically just saving the vegetables, for the next season and keeping them longer. It's really important. I mean, you don't want to just throw your vegetables to the cows, and you don't have vegetables in the winter. Or, for example, they recognized there were some health benefits like having vitamin C, because you don't have vitamin C all winter. You don't get apples, you don't have oranges. At some point in time, there wasn't, international trade for pineapples and citrus fruits. And so by fermenting foods, you are actually promoting vitamin C. And so you can have vitamin C, which staves off scurvy, which is a flesh-eating disease. And there's like a classic story, probably a lot of the fermentation gurus know it well, about Captain James Cook, the man who debatably, found New Zealand, Australia,
Oh, yeah.
and was on his boat, and he was, like, "Hey crew, we're going out on the sea for months and months and months, and we have rice in bags and we have fish in the sea, but we don't have any fresh vegetables." And maybe there was some German guy on board. I don't know. Maybe I'm morphing the story a little bit, but he said, we should bring some sauerkraut. And they brought these big barrels of sauerkraut on board. And half of the crew said, "You know what? This is gross, rotten food. I don't want to eat it." And the other half ate some. And of course, what happened? Those who didn't eat it got scurvy, flesh-eating disease, and some died because
Wow.
they couldn't, vitamin C is quite important. It's very easy to get in a daily diet, but if you're on the ship and you just have rice and fish, sure, you have your carbohydrates and you have your proteins, but you're missing a big part of your vitamins and minerals.
Mm-hmm.
And so there you go, a story of how sauerkraut saves the day.
That's so cool. I love that story. I've never heard that. And I also had no idea that vitamin C was so intertwined with fermented food. So that's fantastic.
Totally. Yeah, there's lots of vitamins. I mean, this is now going into what science is researching now. The vitamins and minerals, vitamin B1, B2, niacin, riboflavin, all of these vitamins and minerals that are present in fermented foods that wouldn't be as present in raw form as a vegetable or a fruit. And so fermented foods really transforms your vegetables. It doesn't just give them a sour taste and let them last longer. There's chemical reactions that are happening that allow the vegetables to be bioavailable, which means our gut, our intestines can absorb the nutrients that are there because these cell walls have been broken down and suddenly open up so that these nutrients are there, and our guts are just like, great, nutrients right now. I don't have to do any work breaking things down or trying to digest it and seeking them out. They're there and available, and very many of them.
Amazing. So I want to kind of go into the idea of gut health a little bit, because I think that's kind of almost a buzzword these days that people might not necessarily understand or like have the foundational knowledge for. So when you think of North American diets that are very highly processed, in what ways are these diets impacting our gut health, and why is understanding the microbiome important for human health?
So a lot of people, I mean, there's just a lot of in the North American diet. I mean, I'm living in Europe now, which I feel kind of far removed from the North American diet, but I just was there for the last month, and again I was shocked at the food culture and how scared everyone is about bread and gluten, and everyone's just freaking out, and it's becoming all these crazy trends around food that in Europe don't really exist in the same way. Because my theory is we are just eating so much processed food. Where can we find raw food? Where can we find raw vegetables, raw foods, raw grains that we ourselves are transforming, or our local bakery is transforming into sourdough bread, where that wheat, that gluten is completely transformed compared to the bread we're getting in the stores in North America. Wonder Bread is just, it's not digested bread. And actually grains, which is a great example, which is really hurting a lot of people's guts lately. Grains are very hard to digest. If we look at a grain just itself, a raw grain, there's so many layers that we have to get through, like first biting into it, right? But even if you had flour, that grain is full of like folic acid and things that our gut can't digest. And so if we're just putting it in there raw, this whole yeast eating the sugars, which are the carbohydrates in the gluten in the grain, they have to be broken down. And when that happens, like I said earlier, yeast eating sugars, creating bubbles, that bubbling action will be happening in our gut, which basically makes people bloated. And they say, oh, I'm gluten intolerant or I have celiac. And often I'm just thinking, bullshit. No, you're just eating undigested bread. You're just eating pretty much raw grains that look like bread and they're not fully digested. So I would just stay away from certain foods like that and go for something more, fully digested, like fermented. When you're working with bread, you're using bacteria and yeast to fully break it down. And in the North American diet, many other things it's really hard to get raw products or even organic milks and just a lot of food. We don't know exactly where it's coming from. And it becomes scary for people, and people are getting more allergic to things, more allergies, and fermented foods now becoming a hype because people are learning, hey, if I have fermented foods, maybe actually it can help with my allergies.
Yeah.
To strengthen your immune system. Because allergies is just a component of a bad immune system. You are not immune to eating peanuts, for example. You're not immune to milk because you don't have these lactase enzymes in your gut. If you do, then you can digest milk fine. Just about introducing the right bacteria to sort of occupy your gut in a way that makes sense and for the products that you want to eat. And we're just becoming so scared of all of the food that we're eating and avoiding other things that we suddenly can't eat things anymore, and people are allergic to everything.
Yeah, that's true. It's such an interesting point that you raised, especially with thinking about grains and like digesting them, because I never had considered that your stomach would be doing the work that, if you were eating a more fermented, like a sourdough or something.
Sure, our stomach is our inner fermentation vessel. When you look at a jar of sauerkraut, that's a fermentation vessel. When you look at a crock or a kombucha glass or whatever, these are all fermentation vessels. And our gut too is a fermentation vessel. So that's where a lot of bubbling action happens, depending what you're putting in there.
That's so cool. And I never really thought about that. And I wonder too, like you were speaking to, a lot of the fears that people have about what's going in their food, or some of the more heavily pasteurized foods like milks or things like that in North America. So I wonder if there is, also that disconnect in terms of what our bodies have historically gotten used to in terms of fermented foods. And now we're shifting into something much more processed. So again, as you said, like the stomach acting as a vessel is struggling to deal with these very rapid process change.
Yeah, totally. I definitely see that. And our microbiome is so central to so many functions of our body, including how of course we feel, how our digestion is, and probably a lot of us, maybe we don't admit it out loud, but our digestion is a very big indicator of how our mood is.
Yeah.
You're not having a good time on a trip because you're not going. You're probably going to be a bit, more agitated. And the digestive system controls so many things, those obvious things, and then maybe less obvious things like how we actually think and feel, because we have a vagus nerve connecting our gut to our brain. So it's an actual nerve that's taking those chemicals that have been transformed in our gut, sending them up to our brain, like our serotonin and our dopamine, and saying, hey, you're happy now, or you're not. And so what we are eating is directly affecting how we think. And then more obvious things like our skin. How is your skin complexion? If it's really bad, it's probably an indicator of your gut microbiome. And this is where science is going now. Science is discovering what the microbiome means, what this gut means, because they've neglected it. focused on the heart, focused on the brain, focused on every other organ. And suddenly they're like, oh yeah, the stomach, the
Right.
gut. That neglected organ is actually very, very central to so many things.
That's really, yeah. And it's so true. And I think I always kind of think back to that colloquial phrase of like your gut instinct and how there's something to that,
Yeah, yeah. In almost every language, they have this gut instinct, follow your gut feeling. In German, it's called Bauchgefühl, which is like gut feeling,
Mm,
or du bist, was du isst. We have that in English too. You are what you eat.
yeah,
I would even say you are what you digest, you know?
I like that. So there's definitely been a rise in the interest and the desire for fermented foods within the last half decade or so for Western cultures. So I'm wondering, were there any catalysts for this sort of awareness changing, or specific people or influencers that brought fermentation to the broader public knowledge?
Definitely. I would say probably everyone's thinking about Sandor Katz right now, who's written The Art of Fermentation, Wild Fermentation. He's kind of the pioneer in this field of making fermentation open to the public, aware, also basically saying anyone can do it. You don't need to have a special certificate or become a super baker, and also introducing how many different ways there are many ways to ferment and what they are. And in his book really writes amazing techniques, descriptions, and varieties of fermentation. So I'd say he's a great influencer. And there's already been for some years quite an upswing in kombucha, and everyone
Mm-hmm.
knows, well, it's good for me. I know it's fermented and it's good. And so this word fermentation now is no longer a scary word, because it usually sounds to people like rotting food, but now fermentation is a buzzword. And fermentation, now I'm trying to introduce more detailed words like bacteria and yeast and mold. And those words are still scary to people. I would say in North America and in Germany, in Europe, where I'm doing courses now, when I say, okay, you know what, today we're going to be playing with bacteria, yeast, and mold, and some people kind of get scared, like, I came for a hot sauce workshop. So just trying to make these things more available, because they're just around us all the time, and just more available in the mind sense, to understand what these words are and actually realize that they're not scary, and that we can work with them together to have a better gut microbiome, or a better understanding of our food in general.
Amazing. Okay, I want to go back to the mold idea, because I was like listening and I was like so into what you're saying, and then you said mold and I got scared.
Yeah.
So for someone who's like very resistant to that idea, what would you typically tell them in terms of like how mold can be useful or helpful to our bodies?
Sure. I mean, we probably have more mold than you think if you're a cheese eater.
Mm,
Is also, depending what kind of cheese you're eating, that is also mold. Camembert, for example, this white waxy finishing on camembert originally is actually very fuzzy. It's like a cat fuzz mold, and it's just patted down with the packaging so it looks a little bit more friendly. But if you were to make camembert yourself, you would have a pretty fuzzy cheese. Um, and what else is mold is miso comes from a mold, sake comes from a mold, tempeh comes from molded soybeans, and they're all very nutritious and they're all very good. And we can go to more friendly things, not mold but fungi, like mushrooms, right? So these are things with spores. And it's just connecting the words, because we've just created a bad association, especially with bacteria. The word bacteria has been forever
yeah.
bad, and we've been using 99% kill all bacterial hand soap. Whereas if we look at statistics, only 1 to 3% of all bacteria known to mankind is bad. And the rest, the 97 to 99% of bacteria that we know as humankind, is either benign, which we don't know if it does something or not, like does something good, or good.
Mm-hmm.
So the 97 to 99% is actually harmless or helpful. And so that we have to restructure a little bit our thinking, how we think about bacteria, because of course there's bad bacteria, but there's a lot more good bacteria and a lot that's on us and in us and around us. So just getting familiar and friendly with them, I'm basically, I don't know, making sure that people aren't becoming germaphobes unnecessarily.
Nice. That's an important job, I think. So I wanted to talk more about your company, Edible Alchemy. So can you give listeners a brief idea of like what the company does and how this project came about for you?
Sure, yeah. So Edible Alchemy is mainly a platform where people can learn themselves about fermentation, how to do it, what it's all about, and discovering the tastes behind fermented products. So right now, a large part of what I do is give workshops or consultations. I've coached some Michelin star restaurants. That's always really fun because they have really good nerdy questions, but amazing sometimes when you go to these restaurants, they say, "Hey, Alexis, come check out what I'm fermenting." And I go to their basement and I look in their jars and I'm like, "Oh, I hope you're not serving that to the customers." So it's a lot of coaching and just, giving 1, 2, 3 rules of what to avoid, what to do, how to get the best product, and of course, safety measures. Fermentation is very safe. It's actually the safest form of food preservation technique that exists. So it's safer than freezing, drying, salting, hot water boiling, canning, because it's creating this acidic environment where bad bacteria can't live.
Right.
But my job is basically to coach people in different skills, whether it's hot sauce or kombucha, sauerkraut, sourdough, bread, cheeses, and just coaching people. How do you do these things? How do you get them, to the best, most desired result? So yeah, that's a large part of what I do. And then of course I do activities, like bacteria bars where people can come and it's a big event and people can have a probiotic cocktail, something like that.
Cool.
And just enjoy learning about more bacteria and yeast. So like art installations and of course partnering up with other interesting food people to just spread food knowledge. Because that's the biggest thing we put into our bodies is food every day. And so it's got to be pretty important in some respects.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, actually, I was reading up a little bit about you while I was preparing for this interview. And I love the phrase from some of your interviews that I think it was the bacteria barista was how you referred to yourself.
Yeah, that's what it says on my business card as well. Bacteria barista. I would also say I'm very much a bacteria dealer. So in Berlin, if you need bacteria, whatever you want, I probably have. And so I'm often sharing, like selling my bacterias to people who need a culture here or there, kombucha, SCOBY, water kefir grains. I have a 152-year-old, soon 53-year-old sourdough bread culture from Iceland.
Oh my gosh.
And so I have this great library of cultures that I just need to basically feed. It's kind of like a little zoo that I have to take care of all the time and share with other people.
That's so cool. So is that like, do you keep that in a lab or is it like, how would you store those sorts of, I don't want to call it a zoo, but like your bacteria?
Yeah, they're pets, definitely. Yeah, I have quite a large kitchen where they're being in different, they all have their own little homes, right? So some are in glass vessels, some are in clay vessels, some are in ceramic pots, others are dehydrated or in the fridge or in the freezer. It just depends what they need and also what the availability is, like what people want all the time. For example, I bake bread every day, so my sourdough culture is super active. I also make water kefir every day, and they're just multiplying constantly. Milk kefir as well. So yeah, it depends which culture it is. I'm only, one person living in quite a large flat share, so I can at least share a lot of these things and do a lot of workshops. So I'm constantly producing. It's constantly getting eaten up and gives me sort of the drive to make more and always create. I would not be able to consume the amount that I'm making.
But that kind of brings you into that. I mean, food is such a social thing. So it's nice to be able to bring that to, like, you, if you're sharing a flat in particular, like sharing that with the people that you live with or spend time with.
Definitely.
So I know you're living in Berlin now, but when you started this project, you were based out of Winnipeg. So I'm curious, can you speak a little bit to the scene, like the fermentation scene in Winnipeg, and how that might be similar or different to the fermentation scene in Berlin for you?
Sure, yeah. So I started it with Natalie, my best friend, in Winnipeg. And I already had the plans to leave after a year to Berlin, not knowing that I would bring it to Berlin and check it out there. But we started it in Winnipeg. We both had traveled a lot and realized what the magic of fermentation could do. Natalie also with her health, she realized that fermentation could be such a support. And me as an entrepreneur, seeing all of these bacteria that I had multiplying, and me saying, I'm going to sell this on Kijiji, which is basically like Canada's Craigslist, and had all these people super intrigued in what I was doing and saying, hey, I can't get this anywhere. I can't get this from the stores, from the organic market, anywhere. I've been looking for it forever. And so I had all these customers coming to me from basically Craigslist to buy my milk kefir grains. And so because I'm intrigued in people, and that's what I live for in the end, is like people, being around people, figuring out what makes people drive. And I asked them, why do you want these things? And the reasoning is most of the time health reasons. And so I started getting into this theme of health reasons through probiotics and fermented foods, and me and Natalie decided to make it a business and open up a workshop to the public and say, let's share this. We have a lot of knowledge, and we have a huge inventory of cultures that we've traded around and built up the inventory. And so when we opened up the workshop, we had a huge interest. And because Winnipeg is kind of a smaller city, it's not teeny tiny, 750,000, I think. Yeah. And however, the interest, you can hit so many people, and then the interest is sort of like you've caught most of the people that are interested. And I find the difference living in Berlin, which is also a much bigger city. We're about 4 million, and also very transient. There's a lot of people coming and going because it's also a very young city, that I find that there's quite a lot of people interested, and I've never satisfied or saturated the market here with fermentation.
Nice. So you've got lots of space to work around with there.
Definitely. It feels that way. And I think the theme of fermentation is well developed in Canada and the US. You can go into many stores and you can buy kombucha anywhere. Whereas in Berlin, when I arrived, there was zero kombucha in the shelves, zero. And so I developed a product with a business partner called Mother Kombucha, and we had our own brewery, and we were one of the first kombucha brands to be on the market. And so now there's, I think, 3 or 4 more, I think maybe 3 that are running.
Amazing.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of space to grow here, as well as it's an international city. So you're having Australians, Americans, Canadians as well who know fermentation looking for these products. And so there's a lot of space to play around with because no one has done it yet.
That's so cool. So I was actually wondering, particularly with your experiences in Canada, did you ever come into any issues in terms of like what you were selling, just in terms of food regulations? Because I know Canadians tend to be more paranoid about like pasteurized versus unpasteurized. So did you have any struggles with that at all, or not so much?
Part of what we were doing, mainly we were selling education. So people could sort of take it or leave it, what we were saying. And if they want, they could buy one of these cultures. So we weren't necessarily selling a product besides the bacteria themselves. And part of the education that we were doing, I guess that sort of saved us from getting into any health regulations there, because we weren't selling a food product. We were selling something like a supply to make a food product. So the way that bacteria work, for example, a milk kefir grains, milk kefir crystals, if you want to call them, you basically use those as a tool to put in your milk, inoculate it, and turn it into a yogurty drink. And then you consume that. So it's kind of like an ingredient, but also kind of like a tool. And at that time, we were doing quite a bit under the table, I guess. And so it wasn't too regulated, whereas here in Berlin, it much more is regulated and what I'm selling. But it's always kind of tricky because the health authorities don't understand. As much as they want to understand bacteria, their understanding of it is this 1% to 3% of bacteria is bad. And anytime they hear living bacteria or living yeasts, they think that's bad. We shouldn't have that.
Right.
So I don't know how far I'm going to be going in that direction to sort of change the minds and understanding and education of health authorities here in Germany. It's a tough job. Believe me, I've been there.
I can imagine.
And I've talked to them about these things, and it just, yeah, it's hard, as well as like in a second language, to explain yourself and how amazing bacteria and yeast are to the health authorities who are, in their 60s and 70s, that really don't want to change their mind because they've known for years that bacteria is bad.
Yeah, that's a daunting task, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So even in Germany, where you have foods like sauerkraut that are more popular, do you find that there's still like a push against fermented foods, or is it a little bit, or do you find that it's kind of shifting now that you've been there for a while?
It's shifting. It's definitely shifting. I can see it year to year. So Edible Alchemy has been in existence over 5 years, almost
Wow.
5.5,
Amazing.
coming January, 6 years. And from year to year, I see the difference. And I remember people telling me, oh yeah, Alexis and her bacteria, kind of, oh, she's doing her thing. That's nice. And now they see and recognize that this is a solid business and makes sense. And of course, I feel like I lucked out, because if I started this 10 years before, I don't think it would have really struck people's hearts the same way. And if I started this 10 years from now, it would maybe even be over. Someone else would have done it. So I really do feel like I struck gold with this strange passion and decided to turn this passion into a business. And yeah, I think it's something that's happening now, and I think the wave is growing. So of course there's room for other people to come in, which I welcome, because I don't want to be, the only one fighting for for this kind of food on the shelves. Like one of my big goals is to get living foods on the shelves of grocery stores, and it's happening slowly, and in cooperation with some partners that are getting this living food on the shelves and fighting against the health authorities to say this is safe food. These are real good bacteria and yeast, and the people need this. So.
Well, I think what really struck me with what you're saying is that it sounds like it's a very communal sort of food scene, which is beautiful, that people are like working together to change the perspective on fermented foods.
Totally. Yeah. And that's sort of how I feel, at least in this city, and in other cities, European cities that I've gone. You go to your local meat man, your local cheesemonger, your local bakery. There are, of course, a couple bigger grocery stores where you can get kind of everything, but you're really in communication with your food handlers. And if you talk to the cheese guys, they sure know what fermentation is, and they know what unpasteurized cheese is, which is something almost impossible to get in Canada, because it's illegal. And here it's just a normal thing. Just part of having cheese is having this living cheese that changes taste every day. And people know that. And so the education around food is quite wide already. It just needs to be widened in the terms of maybe other things, and stop pasteurizing the sauerkraut and do it the way Oma did it. So it's kind of funny that I am the Canadian girl in Germany teaching the Germans how to make sauerkraut again.
Yeah, oh my gosh.
I tell them that, and they start like laughing nervously at the workshop,
Canadian Oma.
Yeah.
So do you have any advice for people who are interested in starting to seek out or creating more fermented foods for their own diets? Like small, simple steps that they can take to begin exploring that world?
Sure. Yeah. I would say, I mean, I always say go with your taste. If you don't like kombucha and you don't like water kefir, go with something else. Go for ginger beer.
Mm,
Or if you don't like kimchi but you like sauerkraut, go with that. Don't force yourself to eat something that you think tastes gross. Even if it's healthy. I think my body changes and tells me different things all the time. It tells me some months that I love kombucha, and then suddenly I'm over it and I don't want it anymore.
mm.
And I really think that's my body just saying, no, try something else. You've had enough. But I would say, yeah, check out what you like first. And then there's a lot of resources out there. Just in the last 5 years, tons of books have come out. If you want particular tutorials on my website, I have free webinars with tutorials how to make certain things like ginger beer or vegetable ferments.
Cool.
Yeah,
Wonderful. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about resources as we kind of start to wind down. So, can you share some of the resources that you'd recommend, or any upcoming events or projects or books or things like that that you're working on that you'd like to share with the audience?
sure. Yeah. So definitely for books, I would recommend Sandor Katz's Art of Fermentation if you want to get really nerdy about it and also have an easy read. There's not many pictures in there, so if you're looking for, fancy looking recipes, I'd go for a different book. But if you want real good information with good resources, also within that, Sandor Katz's book, Art of Fermentation, is incredible.
Awesome.
Um, then there's, of course, a lot of online resources. You can check out all sorts of websites. I would say even check out the Edible Alchemy website. What I've just been recently working on, just in the last months before summer started, was filming an online course because I want to spread this news further than Berlin, further than Winnipeg, further than Australia. I want to share it to the world. And so if people can just click on a button any time of day and learn something about this, I like to call it edutainment, so
Nice.
educational entertainment. Then there's a course that I just built online, and it's kind of like a beginners for fermentation, but it goes through some 16 different courses. So from mixed vegetables, brined vegetables, to sourdough bread, kombucha, pretty much like everything that is basic. We do go into some deeper topics, and there's PDFs there, videos, a lot of videos that I was standing in front of the camera and sweating in my hot studio making ferments. So they were all very happy and bubbling because fermentation very much reacts with heat. But yeah, that's something that people could be interested in. It's a lifetime guarantee. So once you have the course, it's not going to just go away from you after a couple months. You can use it.
Amazing. Oh my
That's
gosh.
your,
That sounds
yeah.
like pretty much everything that you'd ever need to know right at your fingertips. That's
I
fantastic.
would hope so. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what I'm trying to build the course for. And of course, because it's me that's built it and I'm so much behind this course, if people have questions, like write me directly an email and I write directly back. There's no robots involved, no it's just trying to be as transparent as possible, and get this education out there in a way that's handleable, that you can grasp it, understand it, do it yourself, see me do it, read recipes how to do it, and yeah, grasp the whole concept.
I'm so excited for that. I'll definitely be checking that out. So where can people find you if they'd like to learn more about you and Edible Alchemy online?
So on Instagram, we would be ediblealchemy.co for collaboration or CoLaboratory. And on Facebook, we are Edible Alchemy CoLaboratory. And online, we are ediblealchemy.co. Or for the online course, which I'll have everything linked up there, it's ediblealchemyacademy.com.
Cool.
So yeah, lots of links out there. You should easily be able to find us. We often look like clowns because we're doing like this bacteria barista thing, and I love to collaborate. So that's also where the co comes from. So with people who have other skills, ideas, foraging, walks, then we combine all sorts of skills together behind the world of food.
Fantastic. Well, that sounds amazing. And I'll link everything that you've mentioned. I'll put in the show notes and on my website blog post as well, so people can directly link there if they're interested in learning more.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much, Alexis, for coming on. I really loved hearing everything that you had to share about fermented foods.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me.
That was Alexis Goertz, fermentation coach and expert, and co-founder of Edible Alchemy CoLaboratory. If you want to learn more about her work, check out ediblealchemy.co and stay tuned for the launch of her webinars through that site. You can find her on social at ediblealchemy.co on Instagram, or you can find her on Facebook at Edible Alchemy CoLaboratory. I've included all of the links to her website and to her social pages in the show notes for you, as well as on my website, anthrodish.com, under episodes, and you'll find it on the first post for Alexis. So go check her out and treat yourself to some edutainment with Alexis. Thank you so much for listening to Anthrodish. I'm so happy that you came here today. If you love listening, please subscribe and leave a rating and review on iTunes. And check out my website, anthrodish.com, or you can find me on social media at Anthrodish for Instagram or Anthrodish Podcast for Facebook. Thanks again, and we will see you next week.